Show this to you. Maybe you already have it. But
I am kind of familiar with it.
I brought it along just in case we could put it up. We could put it up if you wanted to talk about all the places.
Yeah, it is.
It is. Apparently, the cable runs all the way to some other place and comes back, and in the process, the image dances a little, just to keep you awake.
Wow, that's the reassurance I thought it just made.
Do you mind if I get started?
Not at all.
My very brief intros.
Please do. Yeah.
Okay.
Are we?
That's a good idea to turn. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Kugelman. I am the Program Associate, South Asia Program Associate for the Wilson Center's Asia Program. One of the perks of being employed here at the Wilson Center is to experience the great wealth of expertise that passes through here all the time. This past academic year, the center has been blessed to have had a number of very distinguished scholars and practitioners and the like on South Asia. Some of them are in this room, and one of them is up here with me, Christopher Candland. Christopher is one of our 2009-2010 Wilson Center Fellows. He's been here since September, working on a project on the Islamic social sector, and he'll be speaking about this topic today, focusing on links between Islamic charities and human security. After I introduce him, he'll speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll hear from our commentator, and then we'll open it up to comments and questions from all of you. So, as I said, Christopher is a fellow at the Center for the academic year. He is an associate professor of political science and founding director of the South Asia Studies program at Wellesley College. And he knows much about Pakistan, but he knows much about other countries as well, particularly Indonesia. He's co-founder of and advisor to the Center for Religious and Community Studies in Indonesia. He's held a number of positions in academia and public service, including at universities in Indonesia and the U.S., as well as at the State Department and the UN. So with that, I will cede the floor to Christopher.
Thank you very much, Michael. I will stand at this podium only because I have some images that I want to use to accompany my comments. I want to begin by acknowledging my very great debt to the Wilson Center and to the Scholars Program and to the Asia Program. My fellow fellows, I've heard them say that the Wilson Center is the ideal place to be a scholar, and I think that's true. And I think it's not true by accident. It's true because the people who are working here at this center are very good at what they do, and they make this place the best place on the planet to be a scholar. I'd really like to acknowledge everybody here at the center, but as I don't have time for that, I'll limit myself to a few. First and foremost, I want to thank my colleague and research assistant, Amina Yousafzai, who is sitting next to my mother in the back of the room. She asked some really great questions and provided an array of intriguing answers for my project. I want to thank Bob Hathaway and Michael Kugelman, who took an early interest in the project. Janet Spikes, Michelle Kamlish, and Dagne Gizaw are excellent librarians and excellent human beings who've made my work that much easier. And I want to thank the Scholars Program. Lucy Jilka, Kim Connor, Arlen Charles, Krishna Aniel are the Center's Scholars Program, and Lindsay Collins, all of whom make the Wilson Center really the best place to research and write. And I'm grateful to dear friends and family who I see here. I have to also acknowledge Mehtab Karim, who was very generous and very perceptive in comments that he made on an earlier draft of the paper that I will present to you. And I want to thank Madiha Qureshi for kindly agreeing to give her perspectives on the subject of Islamic welfare associations in Pakistan. I want to start with a brief description of Pakistan's most celebrated and loved humanitarian worker. He's Abdul Sattar Eidi. As a boy, Eidi was not very much interested in going to school. He was not very much interested in playing games. He was interested in combing the streets to find the most destitute individual he could find so that he could assist that person. Eidi arrived in Karachi in 1947 at the age of 20, where he found many people he could assist. He began by retrieving bodies and providing them with a decent burial. He does a lot of that still today, providing free burial services and mortuary services is what he's doing in this image. In time, Edie was able to purchase an ambulance to bring people to hospital. After time, he was able to purchase a second ambulance. More than 60 years later, today, he runs the country's national ambulatory service. He has a fleet of hundreds of ambulances, even helicopters for medical airlift. He was one of the very first responders to the earthquake in Haiti. I start with Edie because among many notable Pakistani humanitarian workers, his experiences and his successes point to three trends which hopefully will flow through this presentation. The first is the power of volunteerism. Edie, having worked without let-up for decades, has grown a welfare service from his own hands, his very hands. He has inspired a force of tens of thousands of volunteers, and he draws tens of millions of dollars annually in donations. He doesn't solicit any funds. These funds come to him, these volunteers come to him because of the silent example that he's given to people over the many years. Volunteerism is an important and significant factor in the Islamic welfare sector in Pakistan, as we shall see, but it varies greatly according to subsectors within the Islamic welfare sector, as we'll get into. The second theme is the limits of state welfare services in Pakistan. Edie's services, like that of hundreds of other welfare workers, substitute for what states usually do. In most countries, even in lower income countries, the state provides for ambulatory and mortuary services. In Pakistan, these services are provided by Edie. They're provided by a private, nonpartisan Islamic welfare association. In most countries, even in countries of far lower income than Pakistan, the state provides for basic education for its citizens. There are a few states that provide a smaller portion of public education to its population than Pakistan does, and the Islamic welfare sector, as we'll get into, fills much of that need. The third theme is the importance of works rather than words. Edie communicates his faith in his deeds. Since he was a young person, people have called him Maulana, because his father used to shave his head to inspire humility in the boy. But Edie himself would grow a long beard. So people would call him Maulana. But Edie declares that his religion is humanitarianism. He thinks that it's better to work in the spirit of Islam for people in need rather than to speak on behalf of Islam. He's sort of well known for not thinking very highly of those who only speak on behalf of Islam. So these are the three themes that emerge from Edie's work: the power of volunteerism, the limits of the state, and the importance of deeds as opposed to words. And as we shall see, these are the dominant themes in the Islamic social welfare sector in Pakistan. Before getting any deeper, I think that this adjective Islamic, which appears in the title, requires a little attention. What do I mean by Islamic? In what sense are the welfare associations that I'm looking at Islamic? Well, an adjective, of course, can do different things. An adjective can describe or characterize, or an adjective can categorize and create identity. You know, in analytic philosophy, we think about how Aristotle defined the way in which adjectives can give identity. Aristotle would have put it in English that a thing cannot be both itself and other than itself. It's not in that analytic sense that I am using the word Islamic. I'm using the word Islamic descriptively to characterize, not to categorize in such a way that analytic philosophers do, because that would get us into the unfortunate business of deciding what is Islamic and what is non-Islamic, pitting Islam against non-Islamic. I want to adapt a definition from James Shaw Howard that an Islamic association is one that is, quote, motivated by Islam and receives much of its funding by those with the same motivation. All right, now that we have a definition of what an Islamic welfare sector is, I think we can now acknowledge some important ambivalences in that. The religion revealed to Muhammad was not a new religion. According to the Quran, Muhammad's religion is the religion of the Jewish and Christian faith. Many of the principles and values of the Quran are reiterations of Jewish and Christian principles and values. To quote Benthal and Bellion Gordon, the doctrine that all wealth belongs to God seems to be Jewish in origin, end of quote. Therefore, to speak of Islamic charity or Islamic welfare is not necessarily to speak of something that is not also Jewish welfare or Christian welfare. The chairman of the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy put this to me, made this very point to me when he suggested that my concept of Islamic charity is a misnomer because charity preceded Islam. Complicating matters a little further, Islam, in its wisdom, doesn't provide any system for deciding who is and who is not a Muslim. One hadith of the Prophet Muhammad holds that if one person accuses another person of not being a Muslim, then the accuser himself or herself will stand in the place of the person who has been accused on Judgment Day. In other words, it's not for us human beings to decide who is and who is not a Muslim, what is and what is not Islamic. That's really the business of God. So I want to use this term Islamic in this way. For me, the revealing question is not whether an association is Islamic or not Islamic. To me, the revealing question are the ways in which an organization can be Islamic. There are two other core concepts that need some definition right up front, and that's human security and the state. The concept of human security was developed to distinguish explicitly between the security of the state, which had come to be referred to as national security, and the security of the people. The concept of national security in international relations had confused the security of the state with the security of the people who live in a particular territory governed by that state. People have been making this mistake for quite some time. Rabindranath Tagore, when he came to the United States and Europe in 1917, used his time to try to warn Americans and Europeans not to let the notion of the nation conflate the security of the state and the security of the people. When I refer to human security, I'm referring to the security of people, not the state. I'm referring to the capacity of an individual to protect herself from harm. Such capacity requires basic levels of health, basic levels of education, but it also requires, as I will get into in the very conclusion, it requires a sense of right. In order to protect oneself from harm, one has to know that one has a right to protect oneself from harm. So we'll return to that at the very end. The state. Well, the state is a collection of institutions. Above all, a state must provide a degree of personal security for the general public. A monopoly of the lawful use of violence, as Max Weber had insightfully phrased it, is essential. Where a person has to provide all of their own security, there is no state. That is, where security is entirely private, there is no state. The state must have a coercive authority, if only to prevent others from attempting to exercise that coercive authority. Okay, probably everybody here in this room has heard that the Pakistani state is failing. It is not failing. Some of the core institutions of the Pakistani state are very strong and growing stronger. The military, the administration of the state, are strong and growing stronger. The Pakistan Armed Forces include more than 500,000 people. The Pakistan government spends more than $25 billion annually, and more than 3/4 of that is raised internally within Pakistan. These are indicators of a very strong state. Other important or essential dimensions of the state, the judiciary, the legislature, these are also very strong and growing stronger than ever. The state is, however, failing to provide millions of its citizens with fundamental protections, that human security that I referred to earlier. That's a big difference between a failing state and a state which fails to meet the needs of its citizens. There are tens of millions of individuals who are unable to get access to public welfare services in Pakistan. The only services available to most of them are those of the Islamic sector. So now I want to move into how significant the Islamic sector is. But I want to begin with a methodological difficulty. and that is that charity is best given in private. A principal purpose of zakat is to come closer to God. But God, knowing everything that everyone does already, doesn't need to see one's charitable actions in public. God knows what one does in private. Zakat is to be given in humility. And because anonymous charitable work is most prized by the faithful, documentation on Islamic welfare groups is self-limiting. And the contrapositive is also true. That is, there are some not so charitable philanthropists who are very great self-promoters. As a result, budget, payroll, and other figures are very difficult to confirm. I'll give you my best sense of some of these figures related to staff and budget and the reach of these organizations in a moment. Zakat is the obligation of Muslims to give a portion of their wealth to the poor, or for some other purposes. There are 7 purposes for the payment of zakat. One of the 5 pillars of Islam, an article of faith, is that the faithful share what is, after all, God's wealth with the needy. Zakat is derived from the word zakah. Zakah refers to both purifying and growing. Foremost, zakat is intended for fakir, for those who are able to work but cannot find work, and miskin, those who are too exhausted or for some reason unable to work. Zakat can also be given to travelers, and it can also be given to zakat collectors. Pakistan, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia are the 3 governments that collect zakat. Zakat is set at 1/40th, or 2.5% of one's unused accumulated wealth. Now, do all Pakistani Muslims give all zakat on time every year? No, they don't. But most Pakistani Muslims do contribute. Data by a remarkable study by Riaz Hassan called Faith Lines, published in a book called Faith Lines, finds that almost 60% of the several hundred people he interviewed in a sample survey claim that they paid zakat in the last year. Estimates are that Pakistanis give more than $1 billion in cash, more than $1 billion in kind, and billions of hours of volunteer labor. A study commissioned by the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy and written up by Adil Najm asked Pakistani Americans to report on their charitable giving. The sample suggests that the roughly 500,000 Pakistanis living in America contribute about $250 million annually to charities in cash or kind, and another $750 million annually in volunteer labor. Most of that labor and much of that money does go to Americans or Pakistani causes in the United States, but a great deal also goes to Pakistan. Of course, even more significant than the contributions that overseas Pakistani communities are making are the contributions that Pakistanis within Pakistan are making. A study conducted by Hassan, which I mentioned a moment ago in that remarkable book called Faith Lines, indicates that more than half of the population of Pakistan does pay zakat. Some of those who answered no, it should be noted, will have answered no because they did not have the requisite amount of assets to be required to pay zakat. One shouldn't assume that everybody in that earlier figure, 39% of the population of Pakistan who does not give zakat are not giving it, even though they should be. And it should be kept in mind that zakat is just one of many ways in which Islam enjoins Muslims to, quote, spend in the way of Allah, or spend in the way of God. In fact, that's a far more dominant theme in the Quran than the importance of zakat, which is itself an important theme in the Quran. Spending one's money in the way of Allah is a continuous theme in the Quran. Welfare services provided in the name of God give opportunities to millions of people in Pakistan to improve their everyday security. And as I've mentioned, Islamic welfare associations provide the only welfare and social services that many Pakistanis will ever receive. The Islamic sector can be particularly effective in delivering social welfare and personal security to the most vulnerable and the least protected, because people can readily gain access to Islamic welfare services without membership. There are registered in Pakistan more than 56,000 welfare associations with federal and provincial government. These are registered as one of 7 different kinds of legal entities. These can be charities, citizens' community boards, not-for-profit corporations, foundations, societies, trusts, voluntary social welfare associations, Waqf, which are religious endowments, and Madaris, which are Islamic boarding schools. None of these, with the exception of the Waqf and the Madaris, are required to make any declaration of faith. So we don't know from registration figures how many of these 56,000 registered welfare associations might consider themselves Islamic. The Waqf and the Madaris do, however, have to make a registration with a particular board of Islam, which we'll get back to in a moment. By the most conservative estimates, the majority of these associations would consider themselves to be Islamic. And of course, there are tens of thousands of other associations which don't register. Here's where I got the most help from Mehtab Karim. He's a demographer. And I was talking with him about the demographics that I wanted to present. There is some political controversy about the exact population of Pakistan. Best estimates put it at about 180 million people. The percentage in poverty, and that's a poverty line which is drawn by caloric intake, 2,350 calories per day is the poverty line, establishes the poverty line in Pakistan. More than 32% by most recent figures of the population of Pakistan live under that minimal caloric intake level. So this is a very not a very conservative measure of what constitutes poverty. The population growth is about 2.2% per year. So this gives us about 54 or 55 million people in Pakistan who are living in poverty, below this minimum caloric intake level. With this growth rate of about 2.2%, this means that we'll have another 20 million such people within the next 15 years. It's that sector that the Islamic, it's that group of people that the Islamic sector is most used by. I think that in the interest of time, I'll skip over a little bit more about the population dynamics in Pakistan. I'll just say that it's a very young country. The average age is 21. And I'll also mention that you might be able to see from this graph that there is a severe gender discrimination. There are many, many missing women. The female-male ratio in Pakistan suggests that there are hundreds of thousands of people who would be alive today, women, if they had the same levels of care as boys did. Female disadvantage, of course, is related to the denial of reproductive rights. Women in Pakistan today have, on average, 4 children. Most women in Pakistan don't want to have 4 children, but that's not their decision to make. So there are very important factors related to fertility and treatment of girls and women that we'll refer to in a moment. Of course, course, the problem with maps like this is that any one piece of the territory of Pakistan looks like any other piece, and that's not the way it is. A more truthful depiction would show how people's life chances are very low in some places and relatively higher in others. Most Pakistanis suffer real physical deprivation. More than 65% of the population struggles to survive on fewer than 2 real US dollars per day. All right, let's move into the Islamic sector. I considered 3 categories of associations. When I came here 7 months ago, I was thinking about the Islamic social welfare sector as a sort of unified concept. I now think about 3 different sectors. One is the state, the other is the partisan sector, and the final and the largest one is the non-partisan sector. And in what follows, I want to make 5 observations, and I'll give them to you now, in case we run out of time. The first is that the state, as it did under British rule, continues to colonize Islamic institutions. But it does so in a particular way in an Islamic republic, and it does so in a more particular way still in a country that was led by a military that was, for a formative period, a front line to Soviet aggression in the region. Number 2, a country as religiously diverse as Pakistan, and here I mean where there are Barelvis and Deobandis and people who are Jamaat Islami and people who are Ali Hadith and people who are Shia and all sorts of other religious traditions, that kind of diversity. In a country that has that kind of religious diversity, state intervention in the Islamic welfare sector has a powerful distrust-generating influence in society, not only within the Islamic social welfare sector, but throughout society. My other points move to those other 2 Islamic welfare sectors, the partisan and the non-partisan. The third point is that partisan Islamic welfare sector is largely focused on education. In my study with Amina's help, we have examined the social welfare activities of all the Islamic political parties, self-proclaimed Islamic political parties, as well as secular political parties that have Islamic welfare programs. And what we find is that most of them focus on education. And what I think is critical here is that, and it's a common misunderstanding, that this education is done in schools, not madaris. This education is done in westernized schools that impart a Islamic education in the tradition of that particular party. It's a common mistake to think that most of the Islamic education is done in the Islamic boarding schools, in the madaris. It's not. It's done in regular schools. The fourth point is that the non-partisan Islamic sector is focused on health. Just as the partisan sector focuses mostly on education, the non-partisan sector seems to be focused mostly on clinics and hospitals. And then the fifth point is that most of the real value of the Islamic welfare sector, whether it's partisan or non-partisan, comes to us from volunteer labor, and most of that volunteer labor is the labor of women. Michael, do you have any idea how much time I have? I've got a few minutes? Good. Because now we're getting into some of the more specific associations. I want to start with the state Islamic welfare institutions. And I have a visual for us. Very hard to read. I'll go over it. The state, of course, has its own welfare associations, but in addition to that, it has Islamic welfare associations. And these are conducted through the zakat boards and committees, through Baitul Mal, through the International Islamic University, through the Model Dini Madaris, and also a Pilgrims Welfare Fund for Hajis. taken together, these programs reach about 2.5 million people annually. And taken together, these programs generate about 145 million US dollars annually. What is, I think, most important here, in contrast to the partisan and the nonpartisan Islamic welfare sector, is that the revenues generated here are generated as taxes or levies. These are not revenues that are volunteered to the state for their Islamic welfare services. And this goes to my very first point about how state intervention in the Islamic social welfare sector helps generate a lot of distrust within society. It was, the idea that Pakistan is a country for the welfare of South Asian Muslims, of course, is not a new one. It's an idea that goes back to 1940. There was some talk at the sessions of the All India Muslim League in the 1940s about welfare in Pakistan. But it really wasn't until the founding of the Pakistan People's Party that Ambassador Lodi knows much about, as her dissertation, her PhD dissertation, was about the Pakistan People's Party. It wasn't until then that we had articulated, really, in Pakistan, the notion that the state ought to be an Islamic social welfare state. And General Zia-ul-Haq, who succeeded Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, pressed this point, that Pakistan ought to be an Islamic welfare state, and promulgated an ordinance, the Zakat and Ushur ordinance, which collects automatically from bank accounts and other accounts 2.5% of people's accumulated assets for the purposes of expenditure through the Zakat fund. Most of the expenditure within the state Islamic welfare sector is generated through this tax on people's accounts. It was a controversial thing to do. Shia, of course, who are 20% of the population of Pakistan, don't pay zakat in the same way that Sunni pay zakat. And so this ordinance of General Zia's, while ostensibly designed to create an Islamic welfare state in Pakistan, actually helped to create quite a bit of sectarian ill will. So I think the point here is actually the point that Jamal Malik has made in his excellent scholarship on the colonization of Islam. This is the point that the state colonizes Islamic institutions because the state, like any state, needs revenue. Governments, the people who manage the state, will find ways to envelop private activity into taxable revenue. But by doing so, they often add to sectarianism. People really do prefer to distribute zakat with their own hands rather than have the government do it. Some people in Pakistan that think that the state misappropriates zakat funds. When Pakistan faced a debt crisis under then Chief Executive and Chief of Army Staff Pervez Musharraf, the Islamic Ideology Council, which is administered by the Zakat and Ushur Ministry and collects zakat, decided that it is appropriate in Islam to use zakat funds to pay down the national debt. And so as a result, people have a sense that zakat funds are not spent as they are to be spent according to the Quran. As a result, there are mass withdrawals from bank accounts just before the government does its annual deduction of that 2.5%. But there are more serious undesired consequences. Shia, who I mentioned before, make their zakat obligations in a different way. Shia can approach the government and be exempted from this automatic collection, but many Shia dislike having to make that declaration that they are not, in the eyes of the government, ordinary Muslims. And indeed, the Zakat ordinance itself spurred the formation of the sometimes militant Shia party, the Tehrik-i Jafri. So that's my, in this presentation, the one example of the way in which, and we could look at other examples, in which state intervention in the Islamic welfare sector has this distrust-generating effect. So we move quickly to the partisan sector. The landscape of political parties, as most of you know, in Pakistan is very complex. There are basically three parties which declare themselves to be Islamic political parties: the Jamaat-e-Islami, the Jamiat Ulama-e-Islam, and the Jamiat Ulama-e-Pakistan, that are Deobandi and Barelvi affiliated accordingly. Those are the three largest Islamic political parties in Pakistan. They all have social welfare activities, but the activities of the Jamaat-e-Islami are by far the larger, which is not surprising given how well organized they are elsewhere. There has been, since 2002, a coalition of Islamic political parties. This was the first coalition of Islamic political parties across schools that included both Sunni and Shia. And there are other political parties that have Islamic welfare services, like the MQM in the Karachi, Hyderabad area, have Khidmat-e-Khalq, which by their own account is for Muslim welfare. And then there are a couple of parties which are interesting. They kind of don't really fit nicely into my category of three separate sectors, because these are parties that are founded by individuals who are known for something else. Tahir ul-Qadri first founded a welfare association called the Al-Minhaj Welfare Foundation, and then on the basis of that success founded a political party. Imran Khan, the former national cricket captain, did something quite similar. That is, he started and raised money for the Shaukat Khanum Memorial Cancer Hospital, named after his mother, generated lots of donations for that hospital, and then thought, I'll found a political party and see how that goes. In neither of these cases is the political party very strong. The Social Welfare Association is far stronger. Therefore, Amina and I have decided to jettison them from our category of partisan Islamic social welfare associations, because they do have political parties, but they're very weak. And the social welfare activities of the individuals who started these parties are far more significant. So these are the parties that are in our study. We also include outlawed parties, which seem to have the majority of the international public attention. A great deal of media attention was focused on the Jamaat-ud-Dawa in the aftermath of the earthquake that was centered in Azad Kashmir in October of 2005. The Jamaat-ud-Dawa is an outlawed organization, but if you look carefully, I should give you the color version, you'll see that the supplies that these Jamaat-ud-Dawa volunteers are bringing to Kashmir are being brought in USAID bags. I don't know whether the contents of those bags are USAID supplies, but this was well covered in the press at the time, that there was a very sort of uncomfortably close coordination or de facto cooperation between the Jamaat-ud-Dawa and the U.S. government. But by far the largest organization is not the one that gets the lion's share of the public attention, but is the Jamaat-e-Islami. The Jamaat-e-Islami operates several very large foundations and societies and trusts. These include the Al-Khidmat Welfare Society, the Al-Hira Schools, the Ghazali Education Trust, the Al-Khidmat Khawateen Trust, the Pakistan Islamic Medical Association, the Pakistan Engineers Forum, and the Reed Foundation. And in addition to these associations, which are legally affiliated to the Jamaat-e-Islami, there are lots of other trusts and societies and foundations that are founded by Jamaat-e-Islami individuals, but their associations are not formally associated with the party. They have an ideological affinity. Let me just take one of these organizations as an example to give you a sense of how strong they are. The Pakistan Islamic Medical Association, PIMA, is a registered charity of more than 3,500 medical volunteers. PIMA says that it is committed, quote, to the understanding and practice of Islamic principles to promote optimum levels in all human potential, end of quote. PIMA medical volunteers work internationally in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Chechnya, Kosovo, Iraq, Kashmir, but also in Pakistan. The major activity of these partisan associations is education. Educators in many of these private schools, by their own account, would like to raise children in the ideology of their political party. It is a common mistake to assume that Islamic boarding schools, madaris, are the chief vehicle for Islamic education in Pakistan. There are thousands of private schools that impart a predominantly Islamic education at a welfare level subsidy, and very little attention, really almost none, has been focused on this sector, this curriculum or the pedagogy in these sectarian, political party-oriented private schools. One of the first things to notice about these schools, if one goes to visit, is that the teachers are predominantly, if not exclusively, women. In some organizations, yes, all of them are women. All of the teachers in the Jamaat-e-Islami's Teacher Training Institute, the Educational Research Institute, are women. Indeed, women are really the core, as I see it, of the partisan welfare sector in Pakistan. And I'm going to try to convey some of that with this graph. This is my attempt to sort of put in one place the reach, the number of people assisted, the resources, the financing, the cash in kind, as well as the labor of the three Islamic welfare sectors that we've been talking about. The state sector is this tiny little triangle here. They reach, by their account, 2.68 million people a year. They raise, by their account, $145 million per year. And by their account, they have no volunteers. They rely on the labor of the partisan and the nonpartisan sector. So in my attempt to sort of give you a comparative graphic of the effectiveness of these three sectors, I've come up with this. And as you can see, I hope, this is the state sector. This is the partisan sector. I'm estimating that the partisan sector has roughly more than at least 5,000 steady volunteers, reach 10 to 12 million individuals, and do so on a budget of at least 500 million US dollars, possibly quite a lot more. And then this larger triangle on the outside, again, it'd be impossible to read, I think, of the nonpartisan Islamic welfare sector, reaches 20 to 30 million people. And this varies not simply because it's an estimate, but also because it varies per year. In 2005, when we had the earthquake in Kashmir, associations, partisan and nonpartisan, mobilized. So this figure varies a lot over time. But our estimates are that the nonpartisan Islamic social welfare sector, the private one, has assets of at least $1 billion US dollars per year, has volunteers of at least 100,000 steady volunteers, and reaches 20 to 30 million people. So, in short, and moving toward a summary, private Islamic welfare associations have much wider reach than either the partisan or the state sector. And I've already noted the two dominant dynamics within that sector. I think it's their focus on health rather than education, and their reliance on women. So I have a note here that says I should start to wrap up, and I want to do that, but I want to cover two sort of larger theoretical issues first. And maybe we'll get into more of this in the questions and comment section. I'm interested in how well the literature, the thinking about civil society and social capital fits this reality of Islamic social welfare work in Pakistan. And I'm also interested in returning to the concept of this question of human rights and the importance of a knowledge of one's rights to the concept of human security. How to do this? Well, I want to start by saying that there's nothing incompatible with civil society in Islam. Civil society, as you know, is a concept that comes out of the late 17th century Scottish Enlightenment, and it's very much based on the notion of commerce. We are civil to one another, paraphrasing Adam Smith, when we have business to conduct with one another. What makes us a civil society is that we are a commercial society. And there's nothing about Islam that would suggest that that couldn't work also within Islamic societies. The Prophet himself was a trader. Islam was born in a place of great commerce. The idea that one needs to treat other people with civility and respect as part of a commercial relationship is completely compatible, I think, with an Islamic society. There's also been some thinking about how well the notion of social capital works with social welfare activities. I think I want to just quickly say that that when faith is the basis of social capital, one dispenses with all sorts of problems that appear to those who work in game theory. Defectors are not a problem. Free riders are not a problem, because if somebody comes into that faith, they don't take anything from the others that are already into that faith. If somebody leaves your church, they're not taking anything with them. Faith in this sense is indivisible. Defectors and free riders are not a problem. Faith is an unlimited resource. What I'm suggesting here is that there is a kind of social capital, often referred to in the literature as bonded solidarity, which operates in a community of faith, which does not present all sorts of problems that other forms of social capital do provide. An example of this, perhaps, is the kind of social capital that Muhammad Yunus has used in the Green Bank in Bangladesh and other places. That is a social capital which is not based upon bonded solidarity. It's not based on the idea that it's one for all and all for one. The Grameen Bank model works because members of your lending circle will not get access to resources if you don't repay. It's based on not bounded solidarity, but on enforceable trust. The reason that a lending circle are women who know each other and are neighbors is that so that they can keep an eye on each other. This is why Muhammad Yunus calls it he calls it social collateral, because people can keep an eye on one another. So I think that in these terms of whether social capital theory might be able to help us with the understanding of the Islamic social welfare sector, I'd say yes, but let us think about bonded solidarity rather than about enforceable trust. The last thing I want to say is about Islamic welfare and human rights. I think everybody here knows that there has been a lot of debate about whether human rights are not Western concepts that are imposed upon Islamic societies. So I'd just like to end by reminding people that Islam has a very rich tradition of human rights discourse. Khuliyat al-Khamsa, for example, are the 5 principles that Imam Ghazali derived from the Quran and the Hadith. And these 5 fundamental human rights, according to Imam Ghazali, are the right to one's religion, the right to think for oneself, the right to life, the right to a profession, and the right to have a family. Some Muslim associations, like Indonesia's Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the largest Muslim association in the world, with something like 40 million members, have adopted these principles, these Khuliyat al-Khamsa, as the guiding principles of the organizations that they run. The Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia runs thousands of schools, dozens of universities, and lots of hospitals. The Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam is also central here. Positive rights are asserted, the right to life, education, work, property, but also the right to education and the right to health. Significantly, the Cairo Declaration does not make it the responsibility of the state to protect and promote these rights, but actually makes it the responsibility of the state, society, and individuals to do so. So what I'm suggesting here is that, particularly with regard to the welfare of girls and younger women, the Islamic social welfare sector has the repertoire within Islamic discourse, but also has the need to promote that repertoire for greater promotion of human rights within the Islamic welfare sector. So I will stop there, and thank you. Madiha, do you want this?
No.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for a very enlightening and in-depth talk on an area of society in Pakistan that really is very covered, very unknown even in this country. So let's now hear from our commentator before we go to all of you for your questions and comments. It's Madiha Waris Qureshi, who's currently an editor at Columbia Books, a publishing company here in D.C., though she has a long association with the Citizens Foundation, one of the largest and most well-respected education nonprofits in Pakistan. I'm sure that many of you know of it. Her work with the foundation has included the development of fundraising campaigns and publications, and also the management of grants for schools and other educational programs across Pakistan. She's currently involved with the U.S.-based partner charity of the Citizens Foundation, which is called TCF USA, which raises funds and builds awareness for education in Pakistan.
Let's test this. Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. Thank you, Michael, and thanks, Christopher, for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to listen to this very thoughtful and comprehensive presentation. As Christopher pointed out in the beginning, the media coverage of Islamic charities based in Pakistan is often very one-sided. It often fails to note just how important Islamic welfare organizations, as defined by him, are to human development in a country where some very basic needs, starting with clean water, sanitation, nutrition, and then going on to things that are considered luxury in that country, such as education or protection of women's rights. A lot of these needs are fulfilled by these welfare organizations. ED Foundation is probably the best example of it, where emergency relief services are provided by this private charity and not the government. You don't call 911 in Pakistan when there's an accident and you want a body to be taken to the hospital. You call ED Foundation. So though it is really easy to bunch all Islamic welfare organizations into this one category, in fact, any religiously motivated organization as either discriminatory in its practices or pursuing very narrow goals, from my experience, a majority of organizations, of charity organizations in Pakistan, are not where they're motivated by religion. They're not discriminatory in their scope, and I believe some of the most effective welfare organizations in Pakistan, as well as in world history, have been motivated by religion. And like all great religions of the world, Islam's core message is that of peace and humanity, and philanthropy is a very, very important part of it. And Islam takes it one step further and, includes zakat as a mandatory, as an obligation of Muslims. 2.5% of annual income is mandatory. And as Christopher mentioned, Pakistan is one of the only 3 countries that actually collect zakat as part of a system. But as he said, a lot of the Muslims don't like to avail themselves of that system and don't really have a lot of trust in that system and prefer to give that zakat on their own. And I would actually think the percentage, the 60%, like you said, it wasn't probably indicative of all Muslims who are capable of giving zakat. But if you consider Muslims who are and who can afford to give it, I would say the percentage would be very high. They do give zakat, but they just don't choose to give it through the government. They would make their own, they would have their own choices of welfare organizations, and who receives most of the zakat, not government-sponsored institutions, but private welfare organizations. ETHI Foundation is probably one of the biggest recipients of zakat in the country. I guess that definition of an Islamic welfare organization is kind of tricky, because a lot of, like, ETHI Foundation would probably not call itself an Islamic charity, even though most of its donors are Muslims. Obviously, Pakistan is a 97% Muslim country. The religious minorities are fewer, but most of their donors are Muslims. A lot of their donations, a huge amount, is coming through zakat. So in that aspect, it will be categorized as an Islamic charity. Now, I'm obviously representing, I'm bringing in the perspective from a private welfare organization, the Citizens Foundation, which is one of the largest education-focused charities in the country. And I think TCF, just as ETHI Foundation, is a good example of how, it's a charity that was founded by 6 deeply religious Muslims in 1995, and although they would admit to you that their main motivation was their religious beliefs and how they consider philanthropy, they wanted to help their fellow Muslims, people in the society, but they went ahead and created a mission that is very, very broad, and it's not discriminatory in any aspect, and basically very, very all inclusive focus, education for all. TCF schools, all 662 of them, educating 92,000 children across the country, do not discriminate on basis of religion. I know when we say 97% of Pakistani population is Muslim, it's easy to think that, hey, discrimination where? Like most provinces, most cities are, majority of them are Muslims anyways, but there are actually religious minorities concentrated in the 2 largest provinces, Sindh and Punjab, and there are certain areas where they are in large numbers. And in those communities, when TCF would build a school, the teachers do have to make a conscious effort to, inculcate principles of equality among the children and prevent them from discriminating against the other children, because unfortunately it's something that's accepted in that society. It's not really frowned upon. So they do have to make that conscious effort, and in that aspect they've really broadened their mission and their focus, and most successful welfare organizations in Pakistan have done that. The one thing that I wanted to talk about was Christopher's, when you classified the welfare organizations, and when you talked about the private welfare organizations, you mentioned that excuse me, health is a major focus of private welfare organizations. I feel like that focus has been shifting in the past decade, perhaps, and to bring in education. As you said, a lot of politically motivated welfare organizations have education as a very important focus, and we see that in the madrasas as well. But TCF is just one example, but there have been a lot of nonprofits in the last 10 years that have been founded and that have taken the concept that education is really something to be invested in, and it's probably the only path to real lasting reform in a very broken society. And as opposed to having short-term goals, being focused on disaster relief or feeding the poor, which is also, of course, very important. They want to invest in something that is an investment into the future of the country, essentially. And there's a lot of foundations, some of which you might be familiar with as well, because they have representation in the U.S. They've gone international and they collect a lot of international donations from international donor agencies, as well as Muslims who are settled across the world. The CARE Foundation, or Development and Literacy, or Al Khan Foundation is one of them as well, that has, of course, Al Khan Foundation has a focus on health as well as education. It has a much broader focus. But the Human Development Foundation, HDF, has focuses on education as well. So I think that focus is probably shifting. We will, and we'll see more of it in times to come, because Pakistanis who form these private welfare organizations or support them are realizing that this is sort of the need of the hour. And the other thing is, I just like some very successful Catholic charities and missions in the world who've done so much good in developing countries. I feel there's a lot of potential in Islamic charities as well. And one of the recommendations that Christopher gave in his paper was that, sorry, just making sure I have the right one. Yeah, so they can play a great part using using Islam as the guiding philosophy and ideals. It's easy to say that these organizations are making great contribution to human security, and I think using examples of other religious charities that have worked around the world and that have done great good in developing countries, I think Islamic charities should follow suit and broaden their focus. That was the recommendation in the paper, that they should broaden their focus. The people who run these charities should visit other Muslim countries and gain perspective. And I feel that is something that they should do. And EIDI Foundation, again, has set a good example of it. Very recently, the EIDI Foundation expanded its focus outside of Pakistan, and they've started going into other developing countries mostly focused on disaster relief. In Pakistan, of course, they also run orphanages, and they have a huge network and like a variety of services that they give. But they went to Haiti. They also helped after the tsunami. They went to Sri Lanka and a few other countries. So that's something that Islamic charities need to do: broaden their focus, and just get out of their comfort zones, get out of that cocoon that they've been in for so long, and broaden their missions to include other parts of the world. And that said, of course, it's also true that not all Islamic welfare organizations are effective, and though their motivation or the intention behind them might be on the right track, a lot of them still exist on paper. A lot of them do receive donations from even international donor agencies and do not really have anything to show for it. And unfortunately, a majority of those organizations are women's rights organizations that claim to protect women's rights but don't really have a lot of actual achievements. So I feel like the best recommendation I can give is just more and more check and balance, and more monitoring from not just the government, which itself the Pakistani government is not really capable of providing a lot of the services that these welfare organizations provide. Let's just face it. They don't have the capacity. They might have the funds, but they don't really have the infrastructure and the system to run efforts like these welfare organizations do at that kind of scale, or just be as organized as, say, the Eidi Foundation or the Citizens Foundation are, and just don't have those kind of people, not that kind of human capital. So check and balance, not just by the government, but by every stakeholder in human welfare in Pakistan is really, really important. We need a lot of charity navigators. We need a lot of monitoring agencies to make sure that these welfare organizations are not just on paper, and they have something to show for their efforts. And finally, I just think organizations like TCF and Eidi Foundation have set a good example, and they present great examples of using broad and inclusive strategies toward human security. And I feel that their models should serve as not just guidelines for other Islamic charities to follow, but their presence should be sort of a source of comfort for us, for international stakeholders like you all, for the U.S. government, for everybody basically who's concerned about the status of human welfare in Pakistan. Faith in the fact that faith is not always a drawback in this case. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We will now go to questions. Before we do that, I just wanted to ask you, Christopher, one question. Going back to the three trends that you pointed out at the very beginning. One of them was the limits of state welfare systems, that Islamic welfare systems substitute what the state can't do. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that for a moment in terms of the implications for governance for the state, the national government. The fact that already the government has a lot of trouble extending services to much of the country, or the northwestern parts of the country. So could you elaborate on that just a bit?
Yes, perhaps by telling a little story that I think it was the very last major terrorist attack in Pakistan of last year. There were some 24 people, perhaps, who were killed in Qureshi town, which is a very large, sort of unplanned settlement, what we call a slum in Karachi. There was a bomb blast. I think 23 people were killed on the spot. This was maybe December 26 of 2009. And the reaction of the survivors of that bomb blast was to go to the local police office and to burn it, to torch it. I tell that little story because I think that it's at first perhaps hard to understand how that could be the reaction, against law enforcement after an episode of a breakdown of law and order. I think that sentiments in Pakistan that are sort of suspicious of the ability of the government to provide for people's security are high, in large part because the state does not a very good job of providing basic, not only security from political violence, but security from all sorts of other forms of violence. And so the reaction of those people in Qureshi town was that the state had somehow failed them, not that terrorists had attacked them, so much that the state had failed them. And so I'm suggesting that many people in Pakistan have a very high level of distrust and suspicion toward the state, in large part, I would think, because of its inability to provide, basic education and health services.
Okay, thank you. We'll have a microphone, and I ask that you wait for the microphone, and whether you make a comment or ask a question, please keep it brief to ensure that we could get to many people. So first, the woman right here.
Thank you. My name is Afifa Saeed. I'm from USAID, and I work with the Middle East and Asia bureaus, and now with the Afghanistan-Pakistan Task Force as well. One of our concerns is, of course, to build the capacity of these NGOs to do the work on the ground. And from USAID's perspective, much of our strategy is leaning towards that through policy, but also through strategy. I'm wondering if in both of you, because Madiha, you brought this up a little bit, but in terms of the work that's being done within these charities, and I'll point to an example of a trend in Egypt, for example, where Islamic charities are going more towards development than just zakat and charity, and just relief. In fact, not just what they do, but how they do their work. They've got some scholarly input on how zakat can then be put into capacity building for the organizations themselves, and therefore come up with something a lot more stronger than just delivering the zakat itself. I'm wondering if that trend has picked up any in Pakistan, especially because of the current situation, and if that's something that, whether it's state-sponsored or not, and I would assume not, but within the organizations themselves, if building the capacity of organizations is somewhere out there in how we could perhaps approach that in a more concerted effort, because like I said, I mean, the money is going there, and we're hoping to build these capacities, actually do the deliverance in a much more effective way, but through better capacitated organizations. So I don't know if that's something you have touched on or you've heard even just conversations about, and if there's some recommendation you would give for us as we look at strategies moving forward and how to engage more meaningfully with these organizations. Thank you.
I think one thing that donor organizations like USAID should look for when they're trying to go through a selection process among the NGOs is whether the NGO has a resource building system or a training system within its within its infrastructure. And I say this because there are certain NGOs who have actually, instead of relying on outside sources, they've developed their own training centers. And the Teachers Resource Center is one such institution. I believe it's a nonprofit institution based in Karachi that provides teachers to NGOs, and TCF, the Citizens Foundation, has its own very large, extensive training center. They've trained 4,800 teachers so far around the country, but they've worked in partnership with the Teachers Resource Center, and they basically help them develop training programs for their teachers. And I mean, this is just one example that I know of because I'm involved with TCF and in the education NGO sector, but where other sectors are concerned, healthcare or whatever other like nutrition or providing clean water or and other capacity building initiatives that are being, I'm sure there are NGOs that have that kind of a system, and basically that selection process should include NGOs like that, and then and create partnerships. Like that's the best thing that I can suggest, because no one single organization is going to have all of that capacity or all of that human capital to in order to provide the donor agency with that assurance that they can do the job by themselves. What we need are partnerships, as many as they can, and so that's my suggestion.
I'd just like to mention two such initiatives or efforts in Pakistan. There's the NGO Resource Center based in Karachi, which is, as you may know or probably know, which was designed to help train NGO workers to become more effective. And then there's, as you probably also know, the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy, which is a more recent establishment, which also has training for NGO leaders. But they also have a certification procedure so that people who are looking to donate can find a organization that has been checked out and is doing good work. What I find interesting about both of these efforts for training of NGO workers is that it was the Aga Khan himself who suggested that these organizations come up, that suggested who should be appointed to the board, and maybe not everybody knows that the Aga Khan, who is the imam, direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and the leader of a significant but small Shia community within Pakistan, which maintains a very large development network, the Aga Khan Development Network. And it was the Aga Khan himself who initiated these two projects to professionalize, really, philanthropy in Pakistan.
Okay, the gentleman standing by the door.
Thank you very much. Raghuveer Goyal, India Globe in Asia Today. My quick question is that people give around the globe for different charities, including here in the U.S. and also, of course, around the globe in Islamic countries in the name of Islam. I just wanted to clarify, because there's a misunderstanding and many people think that some of the money are being used by the terrorists. It's not necessary that they give to the terrorists, but some terrorists may have set up their organization in the name of Islam, charities, and they use for the work that we may not like it or against the human beings or they attack. Can you clarify that how can one stop or where, how they set up their shops and how they get the money in the name of Islam and then use against the humanity or for terrorism, terrorist activities?
Well, just speaking generally, you know, after September 11th, 2001, there were a couple of presidential ordinances which required that anybody who give money to anyone else, an individual or an association, do due diligence to ensure that that association and those individuals were not already identified by the government of the United States as terrorists or terrorist associations. You probably know that the effect of that was chilling. It had a noticeable diminishing effect on contributions from Muslims in the United States. It also, just by the way, had made life difficult for those who wanted to do research with Pakistani colleagues, because you had to check with the Treasury and State Department and make sure that nobody you're working with is on anybody's list. So the State Department has a very, and the Congress has a very well established set of institutions. You know, those individuals and associations are listed under Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. It's very difficult to actually get money out. So I think that perhaps I'm taking your question in a different direction, but I think that now many are of the opinion that we went too far, that we had this scary, chilling effect on philanthropic contributions. And so now there's some other initiatives which others might be more aware of. The Montreux initiative that I believe was initiated in 2005, which was to sort of enable those charitable contributions to start flowing again. So I guess what I'm saying is that in two parts. One is that there is a system in place within the U.S. government for ensuring that financing doesn't make its way to terrorists or terrorist organizations. What we need now is I think, a system that will allow those charitable contributions to flow again. And there are individuals like that, or initiatives like that Montreux initiative, which is attempting to address that.
Very quickly.
Because of this misuse of charities, you think many people now have or giving a second thought, or it has gone down, giving in the name of charities?
I mentioned the work of it was funded by the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy, conducted by Adil Najm. That was done after 2001, and one of his questions was, does the new terrorist financing regulations affect your contributions? And it does. His findings were that Pakistani Americans, but other communities as well, were quite reluctant to give.
Okay, next up front here, Dr. Kareem.
Thank you very much.
Just wait for the mic, sorry.
I have read the paper before, and I think excellent piece of research. One thing which I like to draw upon, two as a matter of fact. One, that what Christopher mentioned, that about 6.6 million or 2.5 million people are being covered through zakat funds. That makes about 5% of Pakistan's poor. What it means that their ground is pretty open, about still 95% of poor are not covered. Of course, both of you did mention, you and Madiha, about Aga Khan, where I worked for many years, and Citizen Foundation, where my daughter worked for a few years. And both are doing excellent work, one in health or both in education. One sector which is left out, which is the private individuals. My own research, being a sociologist, I used to do that. A substantial proportion of individuals in Pakistan, they don't trust many of the organizations which are operating, one. And secondly, according to their own understanding, they have to give charity to someone they know. Someone who's poor, destitute, even relatives, not immediate relatives, but relatives. And that's not covered here, neither in Christopher's paper nor Madiha's remarks. And I think that needs to be looked at. That sector needs to be channelized because many times money goes to individuals who are on doles. And because, EDI or Aga Khan Development Network or citizen foundations, they just look into one aspect, which is either health or education or something like that. Day-to-day needs are not taken care of 30% of the people who are poor. And zakat funds don't reach them at all. As a matter of fact, there are many frauds done there, as everybody knows, in Pakistan. How would you address that sector, the unorganized sector?
I think mostly I'd like to take that as a very friendly and welcome suggestion, that in social science research we tend to have an associational bias. It's much easier to study entities that are registered somewhere, that somebody is keeping track of in some way, if only to find out when they were established and who's on the board and so forth. So yes, it's difficult, but not difficult to make a part of one's study all these uncoordinated, individual, unregistered efforts, but that's not a good enough reason to keep it out or to leave it out. And I just want to underscore that, yes, that's where a great deal, if perhaps the majority of the welfare work is done in that unregistered sector. That is with people who think that their efforts might not go on for years and years, might not be organized enough to bother going and registering, with the government. But these people, as you know, might open their home up to classes for children who are living on the street in the morning, or they might do other kind of charitable work which does not get recognized by the government or by social science researchers. So I'll find a way, but you're right. I think that these individuals and their efforts also have to be incorporated into this.
Yes, Bob?
Bob Hathaway here at the Wilson Center. Christopher, it's been wonderful having you here. We hate to see you go, but that's sort of the nature of this thing we've established here at the center. My question is maybe simplistic, but I'm curious as to this extensive system of Islamic welfare sector. To what extent is it Islamic? To what extent is it Pakistani? In other words, I'm sure there is a comparable social welfare sector in other countries, both Islamic and non-Islamic. But the system you described, has it grown up in Pakistan because of conditions inherent to Pakistan, or is it so widespread throughout the Islamic world that what you really have described as a phenomenon that can be generally associated to Islam, or, as you suggested in the beginning of your remarks, given the close connections between Islam and Judaism and Christianity, are you in fact talking about a larger phenomena that is not particularly Islamic or particularly Pakistani?
I'm not sure you'll like my answer, but it's all of those things. It's yes, I would like people to think that what I have said or what I'm writing about Islamic welfare would also be applicable to much of Jewish and Christian welfare. I recall when I started this project and I went to see my good friends Sue and Ainsley Embry. Sue asked me, "Is there a religious tradition that doesn't have charity?" or something like that. And that got me to thinking that this, of course, is not simply about Islam. It's about faith. And it may be about Abrahamic faiths, but it's not just about Islam. So your question about whether this is more about Islam and Islamic societies or Pakistan, I think it's both. And that's sort of an unsatisfying answer to get. But I think that this level of active work and effort to address the needs of the poorest is common throughout Islamic societies and others. This is not simply a Pakistani thing. But I think that there are some features which are uniquely Pakistani in here. I think that what I tried to indicate in one of my comments about the way in which distrust is generated when the government gets involved in deciding who should pay zakat and who shouldn't and so forth. I'm struck, particularly when I travel from Indonesia to Pakistan, how much there is a sort of the way in which Islam has become so politicized in Pakistan that it's polarizing, and there is so I think there are features of the Islamic social welfare sector in Pakistan that I've been speaking about that don't necessarily translate to other Islamic countries or Islamic societies. I think that the way in which the government, particularly under General Zia, sort of wore Islam on his sleeve, and other places made some of the discourse about polarizing in Pakistan, so that I wish I could come with a good example, but you find, for example, in Pakistan, a large group of or a group of scholars who believe that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are Western conspiracies, and there is a real antagonism between some in the among the ulama who think of NGOs as being non-Islamic. I find that in some other societies, like Indonesia, where there is not that kind of antagonism between the Islamic educators and the work of the westernized NGOs. There's more of a smoother sort of transition between those NGOs which are explicitly Islamic and those which are not. So, thank you, Bob.
I would just quickly agree with Christopher on that, because one thing that we always noticed when I was working at TCF was just how distrustful people are toward any foreign elements. And any NGO that receives a lot of money from foreign grant agencies would prefer not to disclose it to people who it's helping, even in communities that it's like building schools or hospitals or whatever. They would just not disclose that they're getting donations from foreign agencies. It's something I think it is sort of unique to Pakistan, just the level of distrust and how much they trust homegrown organizations that are on the ground, that have grown in their own cities or communities.
Well, I wish we could go on. Sorry, but I promised to get you out at 5:30, and it's just after. So this has been very interesting, fascinating. So please join me in a round of applause for our speaker and commentator. Thank you very much.
Sorry, go.
Well.
I do have a card for a change. Let me just get it.